Hey guys, welcome back to another video. Welcome to part 2 of the chapter 4 series, and in today's video we're going to be having a look at economic growth, and we'll also be having a look at employment and unemployment later on this video, and then finally we will end by discussing about inflation and deflation, which is a really big topic. So this video will be again long, just like the other one, but hopefully you will understand all these three topics by the end of the video. So again, this will be the last and final chapter for the series for chapter 4. We also have chapter 5 and 6, which will be done later on. So this is the final part of chapter 4. Okay, so I have recorded chapter 1, and in there we basically looked at the monetary policy, the fiscal policy, the supply side policy, basically the macroeconomic aims part 1, and I will be linking that video down in the description. But in today's video we are going to be having a look at economic growth firstly, okay, and then followed by the other topics that I mentioned in the start of the video. So let's start off with economic growth. Now, economic growth was discussed in the part 1 video. I believe economic growth was discussed when we talked about the macroeconomic aims. But again, in economics, I guess, we do this topic again in more detail. That was just an introduction so that you understand every time we put the term economic growth. So again, we're starting off with economic growth, and I'm sure you must have already have an idea of what economic growth is. But if you don't, simply economic growth is just the amount of goods and services which are produced in a certain country at a period of time. Okay. Now, economic growth is really important for the government, okay, because firstly, the government wants to increase their output, meaning they want to increase their economic growth because of several reasons that we will discuss later on in this video. Now, so as I told you, the government wants to increase their output, or they want to increase their goods and services, okay? And again, in the definition, it is saying produced per head of the population. Because, for example, in China, okay, and for example, if you want to compare it to US, the population difference is so big. Of course, people in China will need more goods and services, they'll need more food compared to the people in the USA. So therefore, in the definition, we have said per head of the population, okay, per head of the population, meaning an economic growth of one country can be higher even though if the population is smaller, okay? So that's how we can measure economic growth. Now, there are different types of ways to measure economic growth, and let's have a look at that first. Now it says right here, the total value of the output of goods and services produced known is called national output. So the national output is how much, a certain country, produces goods and services at a period of time. And this can be calculated in different methods that we'll have a look at in just a moment. The first thing you need to have a look at, what is GDP? This is not a method, but we also refer to GDP whenever we are talking about the different methods of calculating economic growth. So GDP, which basically means is the gross domestic product, okay? And I'm sure you've heard of this not only in economics, but in the outside world, maybe like you must have heard that the GDP has increased or something like that. Now, GDP in simple terms is basically when the total market value of all the final goods and services provided within the economy. So what this means is that what is the value of this country? What is the value of this country when we're looking at the goods and services? So for example, a certain country has this many types of goods. What is the value of the goods that this country has? Okay, and again, right now you might not be understanding why we need a lot of goods, or maybe you're not understanding why we need so many goods, but just bear with me. In a few moments you'll understand why we need all these goods. Now, but before going to that, we need to know, how can we calculate this economic growth? How can we know that this country has a lot of output, this country has less output? Now, we have three ways, as I previously mentioned. We have the nominal GDP, and the nominal GDP is simply the way we can calculate the value of output produced in an economy in a period of time, which is measured. Okay, here's the keyword. This is the one that separates all this one to the other ones. Measured at their current market values. Okay, this means their current market value. Okay, so the current time of the output, it's measured according to that. Okay, or the prices in the nominal GDP, and this is what we call the nominal GDP. So this is the first way to measure. The first way to measure is to check the current market value of these goods and services. The second method is called the real GDP. The real GDP is when you check the value of output produced in an economy in a period of time, which is measured assuming the prices are unchanged over time. So this is the second method. You're assuming that the prices are going to be the same throughout each year, and you will calculate your economic growth. Okay, and this GDP in constant prices provides a measure of real output, or the real GDP of a country. And finally, last but not least, is number 3, where we talk about the GDP per head. Okay, and it comes from its name, the GDP per person, or the GDP per population. Okay, so in this case, the GDP is calculated according to the size of the population. So what you do is the output, or the GDP over the population, so you can know the value of this country. So for example, the one that has the highest GDP will be having a very good economy, or a good economic growth. Okay, so in this we are looking at the output per person in an economy. Okay, and you can see right here, this is the formula to calculate it. This is the formula to calculate it, which means GDP per capita simply equals to the GDP per population. So you need to know this formula. Sometimes you can be asked, in your MCQ questions to calculate the GDP. So you should know this. Okay, with that being said, let's move on to something called an increase in real GDP over time indicates economic growth. Okay, so now finally the question that I've been saying throughout the video: why do we need good economic growth? Okay, now as goods and services have increased, okay, when you have more goods and services, okay, or when you have more products. So let's look at it in this way: more products. Okay, we have more stationery made, we have more furniture made, we have more houses made. These are all goods and services. This means that this economy, or this particular country, is utilizing its resources better, meaning it's using all the resources they have in their country to make these products. Okay, so meaning they're using the resources. So that's the first thing you need to derive. When there is more product, that means they're using more resources. The next thing you can say is that we can represent this on a PPC curve, and the PPC curve can help us show the economic growth. Now I've made a video on the different graphs that you need in economics, and we have talked about the PPC curve, okay? But in simple words, the PPC curve is the production possibility curve, and it just shows the maximum combination of two goods in an economy. Okay, so using the help of economic growth and the help of a PPC curve, we can represent we can show if these resources are being used wisely. Okay, and this of course will be an outward shift, because remember, we know that when there is an increase, or when there's more resources being used, there is an outward shift because the productive capacity has increased. Okay, the next thing, okay, we've talked about that the economy is using resources. When the economy uses resources, there's several benefits. Okay, so the first thing, there's more products. More products will mean there's more economic growth. Okay, that's what the government wants, because when there's more economic growth, we're using more resources. When we're using more resources, then there will be more workers. There'll be more opportunity for employment. Okay, there will be more opportunity for employment. When there's employment, the person will have a higher income. Okay, when they will have a higher income, they will buy goods and services. Okay, and when they buy goods and services, the taxes go to the government. So you can see that chain. Hopefully you understood that chain. This is the chain, or this is the reason why we need to have a lot of goods. Okay, and I'm emphasizing this because this is an introduction of economic growth, and you need to understand why we have, or why we need to have a lot of goods and services in the economy. So that's the first thing that you need to know. Secondly, the economy is initially at point A. Okay, right here you can see. Okay, and it's moving to point B because the productive capacity has increased, and therefore this is a result because of economic growth. Okay, hopefully you've understood till here. If there's any questions, again, the comments will be available. Now With that being said, a quick introduction of economic growth, why we need economic growth and the different ways to calculate economic growth. The next thing we need to have a look at is the causes of economic growth. How can we make this economic growth increase? Okay, because remember, this is the number one, reason why. Okay, this is something that the government wants to do. Okay, they want to increase the economic growth, but how can they do this? Okay, there are several ways they can do this. Let's start off with number one. Number one is the discovery of more natural resources. The discovery of more natural resources would mean that if they have more resources, of course, they can produce more output, And an example would be, for example, Dubai or the UAE has a lot of oil. Okay, that's a resource. If they have a lot of oil, they are a rich country because they have many resources, hence the economic growth must be high. Okay, you see, this is how you can understand if a country is rich or poor using the help of economic growth. This is just one of the factors that can help you decide whether a country is rich or not with the help of the economic growth. So the one way is discover new resources, meaning to discover new resources, you simply dig underground, find resources, make goods out of those. For example, go find the minerals, get the jewelry, make the jewelry, and sell the jewelry. This is all going to increase the economic growth. So that's number one. That's one way to increase the economic growth. What's the other way? The other way is investing in new capital and infrastructure. This means that we invest in new machinery, in buildings, technology, and lots more. Because remember, when there is more production, when there is efficient production, there will be more goods and services produced per period of time. Because, for example, if your factory or the machines there are very efficient, meaning they're very quick, they're very fast, okay, and they're very accurate, the goods per time will have increased, and hence the economic growth will have also increased. Okay, so that's how you relate the different steps. And the government, what they can do is, for example, provide subsidies to the business so the business can invest, and then when they get those good machinery, their output will have increased, which will help the government. Okay, and because if I go previously up here, this is the reason why we need economic growth. Okay, because it's going to benefit the country because everyone will have a high income, and it will also benefit the government because it will become more stronger because they will get taxes when people start buying those goods and resources. Okay, goods and services, sorry. So hence it's a win-win for everyone. Therefore, the government really needs to focus on that economic growth. The next one right here is the technical progress. The technical progress basically means is we need to invent stuff. We need to invent something that is efficient. We need to invent the productivity, meaning, for example, if you lower the minimum wage or something related to workers, for example, if you make workers motivate, meaning they should work, okay, using these inventions, maybe telling the workers that they will get a reward, then that will mean they will start working. And if they work, remember, the production will become more effective, and hence the output will increase. Okay, so that's one way. The next way, number 4, is increasing the quantity and quality of factors of production. We know the 4 factors of production: capital, enterprise, land, and labor. Increasing these will therefore increase the output. For example, if I increase the workforce, there will be an increase in GDP. When I increase, for example, if I invest in education, people will be more skilled. If people are more skilled, they will want to work. If people want to work, then the output will have increased. And if the output would have increased, economic growth would happen. So, economics is more of just linking your ideas from the basics, what the government can do, to what that will result, and finally to meet their objectives. So that's how economics works, and you need to really understand that economics is all about linking your points from one another. Also in the exam, your 8-mark question, your 6-mark question, you need to link everything. Okay, I've made a video on linking your points, which is I talked about discuss questions. Again, I'll put all these videos down in the description so you can have a look at. But if you don't, you can always go to my channel and find the economics videos to help yourself out. I also do many other subjects, so you can check those out too. Okay, That being said, let's move on to the next point. The next point is reallocating resources. Okay, so when we're saying reallocating resources, we basically mean by moving the resources from less productive uses to more productive uses, which will improve the economic growth. That's quite self-explanatory. Basically, less productive uses to more productive uses will just simply improve the economic growth. So basically, in these last 3 points, we're just talking about efficiency, meaning everything has to be efficient so that we can get more output. Okay, so that being said, now, okay, let's revisit the benefits of economic growth. I've already, given you a small brief of why we need economic growth, but why do we need economic growth? What's that important that we need to, do investments and all this just so that we can increase, the output in a country? So let's have a look at it, because there are many benefits of economic growth. The first benefit is that there will be greater availability of goods and services, because if, for example, I want this, it's there. I want this, it's there. I want furniture, it's there. Everything is there, and hence the consumers will be satisfied. The consumers will be happy. They will be willing to stay in your country. So that's done. The next one is they have increased employment, because if we have more resources, we need, of course, more workers, and hence there will be an increase in employment. Okay, then we have that if there is an increase in employment, meaning the income will rise. If the income will rise, the living standards will increase, and hence it will bring out people from poverty. And we will also be talking about poverty in chapter 5 or 6. One of them will be talking about the entire poverty section, which is a really big topic. So economic growth really benefits that too. The next one is it will of course increase the sales and profits of a business, which therefore means they can invest further and they can make more firms, which will again eventually just benefit the government. Last but not, quite a lot more. We have rising output and demand, which will encourage investments in capital goods for further production. So capital goods, remember, is simply just goods that help us in the production of goods and services, and we know this from the factors of production. Now, rising these outputs will encourage, of course, investment, and if you invest, then there will be more economic growth, and it will keep increasing every day. So it's sort of like a chain effect. Okay, the next one is that there will be low and stable inflation. Inflation, which we will talk about again in this video. Inflation, in simple words, is just when the demand increases, which will result to high explosion of prices. But in this case, because there are many resources, the demand is equal, there will be stable inflation, because the growth of the output will match the demand, hence there will be inflation. And last but not least, there will be an increase in tax revenue, because when there is an increase in tax revenue, this is because the incomes will rise because they are employed, the workers in the country will be employed, hence the income will rise, meaning there will be higher expenditure, which will lead to tax revenue, and this tax revenue then can be used to help the country, meaning, for example, infrastructure or something like that. So infrastructure or something like that. Now, with all these benefits, there's also the drawbacks, okay? And there are quite a lot of drawbacks, because, not all this, first of all, is free, because the government has to do a lot. And not all of this, goes according to plan. So we have different drawbacks of economic growth. And the first drawback is something what we call the technical progress, which basically means because people invest in these capital, because these firms invest in this capital, okay, there will be a rise in unemployment, okay? And because there will be a rise in unemployment, because workers are really expensive, therefore why would you hire workers? Instead, why not buy machinery, which will be helpful in the long run, which will be cheaper, okay? So therefore that will cause an unemployment, and if it causes unemployment, there will be less income, and therefore will be leading to poverty, and poverty is the worst thing any country will want to see. The next thing, scarce resources are used up rapidly, because we said that resources is the reason why we have economic growth. If we use all our resources, okay, what will happen in the future? Okay, it will be depleted, and then what happens? Then there won't be economic growth, then everything will be the drawbacks. So we have to be really careful when using those resources. The next thing is that when you're increasing the production, it will also increase negative externality, because when you're using more machineries, there will be more pollution. If there's more pollution, it will affect your citizens on the end of the day. Okay, it will affect your citizens. Hence, you have to also have a look at pollution, because pollution nowadays is becoming such a big thing. Global warming and everything is becoming such a major part, and you need to have a look at that too. The next thing is that if the economy produces over the productive capacity, meaning if there are too many resources being produced, then there will be inflation. Because if the demand is so much and the resources are less, then the prices will rise so much that there will be inflation. And finally, it says that the economic growth can also be accused of widening income inequalities, because the rich become richer and the poor become poorer. Hopefully, you've heard that phrase somewhere else, and it applies also in economics, because it's quite hard, for the working class to actually, get these products to themselves, because they have to pay much more higher, and hence, the rich investors, when they start up their firm, they get more money. The poor will left being poor. Okay, so that's how that works. Now, so the government wants to aim a balanced economic growth. They want to have good positive sides and less drawbacks. So meaning they have to have a balanced economic growth. Hence, they need to do whatever they have to do in a balanced way. Now, if that doesn't plan, something called recession happens. If there are so many drawbacks, something called recession happens. And recession is when there is negative economic growth, meaning it's the opposite of economic growth, meaning the output reduces. So now let's have a look at recession. Okay, so far hopefully you're understanding how economic growth is derived, how economic growth works, and how everything is related to one another. So, causes of recession. There are several causes of recession, and we're just going to be quickly going through the causes of recession. The first thing, financial crisis. Financial crisis is basically if banks have a shortage of liquidity, they reduce lending, and this will reduce the investment. Okay, this will therefore reduce the investment. The next one is there will be a rise in interest rates. When there is a rise in interest rate, that means people will not borrow a lot. If they don't borrow a lot, then they can't spend a lot, and hence the demand will reduce. And if the demand reduces, why would a producer make resources? So of course it will fall. The next one is the fall in real wages. When someone does not have a high income, they will not spend a lot. Hence there will be a recession. The next one is the fall in consumer confidence. If there's a fall in consumer confidence, they will save the money instead of spending it. The next one is the appreciation in exchange rate. That means that, exports will be so expensive that, this will cause the demand to fall. People will just import from other countries. Hence, it will cause a recession. The next one is that the fiscal austerity, sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong, but basically what this means is that the government cuts spending and the demand falls, because we know that when the government spends more, the demand will rise. For example, if the government spends on education, people will gain the skills. If they gain the skills, they will get work. If they get work, they will have higher income. If they have higher income, they can spend more. But if this doesn't happen, the demand will fall, causing recession. The next thing is trade wars. Trade wars is basically when uncertainty in the markets, okay, and thus the businesses will be reluctant to invest during a trade war, and this will cause the supply to fall. So for example, whenever some crisis happens in the country, no one will invest, hence there will be a recession. Okay, for example, COVID-19. Okay, that's an example. And what this basically means that when that happens, businesses will not grow. They don't want to produce more goods and services. Hence, the supply will fall, hence causing recession. Then we have something called the supply side. This was actually meant to be the black swan events. Trade wars basically means when there's uncertainty. Okay, it's not a must. It has to be like a pandemic or something, but it's when there's uncertainty. Then we have the supply side shocks, which basically means when there's a rise in oil prices, this will cause inflation. Sometimes, it just rises. When you have limited resources, the price can just rise, and this would lower purchasing power. Okay, so that is all about the causes of recession. Let's have a look at the the consequences of recession. Now, the consequences of recession, there are quite a lot of them. First of all, you need to say that when firms go out of business, okay, demand will fall, firms will be forced to either reduce the production level or, close down. This will cause a recession because the fall in output. We have unemployment. When there's unemployment, the production will not be efficient, hence it will fall again. Then the fall in income. When there's a fall in income, the demand will be less. Okay, and when the demand is less, then the production will be cut. Because why would they want to spend so much money if they're not getting a lot of profit? The next one is when there's a rise in poverty. When there's a rise in poverty, it's kind of sort of linked to the fall in income. So when there's a rise in poverty, the fall in income, and hence there will be fall in demand. Hence, if there's a fall in demand, then the recession will occur. The next one is when there's a fall in the asset prices. When the fall in the asset prices basically means, for example, if recession trigger a crash in the stock market, then the investors of that stock market will not be confident to invest more into the market. Hence there will be a fall in recession, or there will be a recession, because when they have low income because of that crash, when they lose all their money because of that crash, they will not be willing to spend a lot. Therefore they have to be really cautious of where to spend their money and what to spend their money. And that's where we come to the needs and the wants. Okay, so yeah. Then the next one is higher budget deficit. Higher budget deficit basically means because of that fall in consumption and incomes, the government will see a fall in tax revenue. Okay, and if they have a fall in tax revenue, then they can't spend a lot. Therefore there will be a budget deficit, because they can't, if the government does not have money, they cannot really spend on anything. Okay, hence there will be higher budget deficit. And finally, last but not least, it says that there will be a permanently lost output. That means as firms go out of the business and employment will fall, then if you don't have employment, you don't have workers, you don't have those capital goods, then it will have an inward shift, meaning there will be recession. So economic growth will be an outward shift. So you can say that it will be an outward shift for economic growth. Okay, so this is economic growth, and the opposite, which is recession. Okay, so that's what you need to know, and we can represent this on the production possibility curve. Okay, now let's talk about the policies to promote these economic growth. So we have talked about the benefits of economic growth. We've talked about the disadvantages of economic growth, meaning recession. But now the main objective, of course, is to have the positive side of economic growth. And how can we promote this? We use something called the policies that we mentioned previously in part 1. In this, we're talking about expansionary fiscal policies and monetary policies, and of course supply side policies. Okay, now the different various policies can help in economic growth. For example, one sort of policy can help increase employment. Increasing employment, of course, will increase the output, but I won't go so much in detail. Hopefully part 1 you understood the different ways or why we use these policies, and it's the same thing, just to increase economic growth. Okay, now what is the effectiveness of these policies? Why should we do these policies? First of all, for example, a demand side policy will increase the rate of growth above the long run trend rate, which will cause inflation. Okay, and quickly will lead to recession if not controlled. Okay, so the demand side policy is basically talking about the increase in the rate of growth, and if it's too much, then it'll cause inflation, and if it's not controlled, it'll cause recession. So this is a really it's sort of like a risk, but at the same time, if high risk, high reward, sort of stuff like that. Because if the government, balances it, then there will be a very good, effective sort of control. The next one is that supply side policies can take considerable time to take effect, because supply side policy, for example, if you think about it, the government invests on education. Okay, now education doesn't just happen overnight. It will take several years. A student, for example, will go to primary, will go to secondary, will do university. That's almost 15 years. And then he will find a job. Okay, so it will take a lot of time for that economic growth to happen. So supply side policy, at the same time, you need to consider that it will take a lot of time. Okay, the next point is that in recession, supply side policies won't solve the fundamental problem of deficiency of aggregate demand. Okay, hence increasing the flexibility of labor markets and encouraging. Okay, so because supply side policy won't just solve the problem, you will have to also be more flexible with the labor markets, and you have to encourage investments so that you can help the businesses at some extent. So there you go. Those are just all the policies, and that is everything about economic growth and recession. Okay, so that's everything about those two. Okay, hopefully you understood it. Hopefully you understood the benefits of economic growth, the drawbacks of economic growth. We talked about recession. We talked about the causes of both, and we've basically looked at how we can increase the economic growth, because at the end of the day, the government wants to increase their economic growth. Now, that's economic growth. Okay, we now move on to a topic: employment and unemployment. A big topic again, and actually, it's discussed in many other topics, but employment is a type of topic which is so broad. Okay, that you have to really look at it. Okay, because in employment there's so many advantages that the government has to look at this. Okay, the government needs to have a high employment rate, and because what sets apart a developed country and an undeveloped country is the employment. Okay, because if you've noticed, the high employment countries will have such high employment, while the third world countries will have low unemployment, or will basically have very that most of their citizens will be unemployed. So the government has to ensure everyone is employed. Okay, and hence we will be discussing about employment. I don't think it is that big of a topic, as you guys can see. Basically, it's not that bad, not that small topic at the same time, but yeah, it's not that complicated, because we know what employment and unemployment means. So macroeconomics is a subject where you already know these types of stuff. You already know about tax, you already know about employment, you already know about these sort of stuff, so it doesn't become that hard to understand it. Okay, and hence macroeconomics is very easy topic. Okay, so with that being said, let's talk about employment and unemployment. So labor force. Okay, let's start off there. We need to have a look at the definitions of all this. Labor force is simply the working population of an economy, the working population of an economy, because not everyone works. For example, the lower aged people cannot work, hence they're not part of the labor force. So the labor force is the people that is working, and it's really important to know the labor force of a particular country, because with that you can make your decisions according to that. Okay, the next one: dependent population. Dependent population are people that are not in the labor force, hence they depend on the labor force to supply them with the goods and services. Okay, so in this, for example, we have the students, we have the education, we have the retired people, the people that stay at home, we have prisoners, sorts of people like that. They are not in the labor force, they are not working, they are relying on the labor force so that they can survive. Okay, for example, retired people, of course, students, and all sorts of people like that. So that's called the dependent population. So what is employment? What is unemployment? Okay, what's the meaning of employment? What's the meaning of unemployment? Employment, let's start off there. Employment is defined as the engagement of a person in the labor force in some occupation, business, trade, or profession. So the main thing is that they're basically in the labor force. Unemployment is when they're not in the labor force and they're looking for jobs, or they're currently unemployed. Okay, so it says all the governments have the macroeconomic objective of maintaining a low employment rate, because every government needs a low unemployment rate because of many other advantages. Because if there's a low unemployment rate, there are many advantages to this. Okay, so then we have full employment. Full employment is simply where the entire labor force is employed, but this is usually nearly impossible because there's always, the little bit of this is a situation which is usually impossible because, not everyone wants to work, right? Not everyone feels like working. Some people are dependent on others, hence it's really unlikely to have a labor force which is fully, which everyone is in the labor force. So therefore, but in this case, if there was full employment, that means the unemployment rate was 0%. Let's have a look at something called the changing patterns and level of unemployment. Because employment keeps changing from year to year, and there are different cycles of employment. And why is this? We have three of these reasons why. The first reason is because the effects of the business cycle that every economy gets through from time to time. Okay, and this is growth and recession. Okay, so this basically means the business cycle. For example, if there's recession, they don't want to be employed because they're having such losses. They are firing people because they can't afford it. The next one is because it could be due to changes in the demographics. It could be due to the changes in this demographics. For example, the population. If there are many kids in your population, they can't work, right? And the more kids that are coming, the less the employment rate. Okay, so that's one reason why the employment can be low. The next one can be maybe because it could also be due to the structural changes. For example, the dramatic shifts how an economy operates can also happen. Because, for example, if the economic growth reduces, then there will be low employment. Okay, and several other factors that when we have a look at the structural changes. Okay, so that being said, those are the three factors that can help or can, change the employment from time to time. Okay, so as an economy develops, it undergoes a structural change as the output and employment shift from the primary sector to manufacturing and then to the tertiary sector. And this can be seen in rapidly developing countries, for example, India, where the employment in agriculture is very high. So employment can change, some can have high employment in a certain sector. Okay, we have three sectors. We know these sectors, right? The primary sector, the secondary sector, and the tertiary sectors. Hopefully you should know these sectors. We've talked about this previously, I think, when we talked about specialization of labor or something related to labor, because we've done this topic before, but not exactly, but we've talked about this. Okay, because we've talked about labor and we've talked about the different types of ways someone can be specialized or something like that. Now, how is unemployment measured? Okay, how can we decide that this country has an unemployment rate that is very high? How can we decide this? Now, economies periodically calculate the number of people unemployed in their economies to check the unemployment rate and to see what policies they should implement to reduce it if it is too high. And they can do this into two ways. The first way is called the Claimant Count. Okay, the Claimant Count is basically when unemployment people can file for unemployment claims, benefits. For example, remember, if you're unemployed, the government can give you some claims. For example, they can give you a little amount of money so that you can survive in their government. The next one is the labor service. Okay, the labor service is basically when the economies conduct surveys among the entire labor force to collect data about it. How do you calculate unemployment rate? The number of people unemployed over the total number of people in the labor force. That is how you calculate it. Okay, so we have underemployment and then we have the inactivity rate. Okay, because underemployment basically means that people may be officially classed as employment, but they may be working only for a few hours, like maybe 1 hour. Okay, they might have a part-time job. Okay, that's what we call underemployment because it's not really benefiting the society, but technically they're employed. Okay, the next one is inactivity rates. Inactivity rate basically means that the long-term unemployed may become discouraged and leave the labor market completely. In effect, they are not working, but they are classed as economically inactive rather than unemployed. So the unemployment rate can be understated. Okay, so here again we have another way is that the unemployed may be discouraged and leave the labor market completely, so they're not working. Okay, so the underemployment rate or the employment rate will be understated because they leave it. Now we have different types of unemployments. Okay, and sometimes in your papers you can be told to identify this sort of type of unemployment, or and so on and so forth. So we have several types of unemployment, and we're going to have a look at it now. Let's start off. Frictional unemployment. Frictional unemployment. The first one. This occurs as a result of workers leaving one job. Okay, so let's get the highlighter. They're leaving one job, and they're spending time for looking the other. So meaning they're unemployed, but they want to be employed. Okay, and this type of employment, is short-lived, meaning once when they find the job, they will become employed. The next one. Cyclic unemployment. This happens when there's a fall in demand, okay, maybe because of a recession. And when they fall, the firms will cut the production, and hence the workers will lose their jobs. Okay, and this is why there might be unemployment. The next one is structural unemployment, and this occurs due to the long-term change in the structure of an economy. For example, workers end up having the wrong skills. For example, they've studied a certain type of skill, and then they just change to employment. Then they decide, I don't have the certain skills, so they just say that, no, I'm not ready for this type of employment. So they decide not to be employed. But in this, we have two categories. We have the technological unemployment. This maybe can be because of a robot. For example, if there's a robot, then they're doing work quicker than a worker, and it's cheaper. Of course, you'll hire a robot. Okay, so this can be because of a technological unemployment. And then we have the sectoral unemployment. And sectoral unemployment basically means is that the unemployed caused as a sector industry decline and leave its work unemployed, meaning that maybe, for example, a particular industry has run out of the need, hence it will leave the workers unemployed. Or maybe, for example, a certain type of skill is not needed in the future, for example, and it can happen, hence the workers will be left unemployed. Okay, then next we have the seasonal unemployment, which basically this occurs as a result of demand for a product being seasonal. For example, the demand for umbrellas will fall in the non-monsoon seasons, and so on and so forth. Basically, whatever you're doing there can be seasonal unemployment. Okay, and then we have the voluntarily unemployment. This basically means someone can rely on someone, or someone wants to pursue something else, or they also just simply want to take a break, hence they will be unemployed. So what are the consequences of unemployment? Why should we have a high employment rate? First of all, if people are unemployed, okay, their incomes will be low. As you can see right here, incomes will be low, and hence the living standards will fall. If people are unemployed, it will lead to poverty. If it leads to poverty, there will be more homeless people, and the crime rates will increase, which is never good for the economy. Then we have people losing skills. If people lose the skills, it is not just detrimental to be unemployed individuals, but also to firms who may employ these people in the future, and hence they will have to retrain these workers. Okay, when people lose the skills, they'll have to retrain these workers. Okay, so which is not really good, because when people become unemployed and then want to be employed again, they lose all their skills, so they'll have to retrain these workers. The next one is that the firms may have to pay redundancy payments to the workers they lay off, because the economy wants to have a high employment rate, and hence they want to make it hard for the firm to lay off people, hence they have to pay a redundancy payment. The next thing is that workers may be demotivated as they fear they could lose their jobs, and hence especially in a recession. Because if the recession happens, for example, if a pandemic happens, people of course will be scared they will lose their jobs, because maybe they're relying on that job. So the workers will be really demotivated. Okay, so that can be a consequence. The next one is that as firms lay off workers, they will have more money, or maybe they'll have spare capacity, meaning they will have unutilized machinery. Okay, and hence they will have higher average costs. They'll have higher average costs. Okay, the next one is due to low income, people's purchasing power will fall, and hence the demand too will also fall. Okay, the demand will also fall then. because the purchasing power will fall because they have low income. The next one is that people sometimes, okay, because this is actually true, because some people will remain unemployed because of the government unemployment benefits, okay, and people remain unemployed so that they can get all these benefits and they don't even have to pay tax. But the taxpayers will have a burden because all the money goes to the people that are unemployed, so the burden increases for the taxpayers. The next one is that the public expenditure on other projects such as schools, roads, etc. will have to be cut down to make way for benefits, and there is an opportunity cost involved here. Okay, there will be opportunity cost involved here. And lastly, it says that when they're economically inefficient on the PPC, okay, meaning the economy does not reach the maximum productive capacity, the economy loses output. Okay, so that is that. And then okay, so let me see, yeah, let's now have a look at this very long topic, or this very long subtopic: policies to reduce unemployment. Okay, the policies to reduce unemployment. Now, both demand side policies and supply side policies can help reduce the unemployment. Okay, and demand side policies will address the unemployment caused by the demand deficiency, while the supply side measures can be structural structures and frictional unemployment. Now, how can we reduce unemployment? There are different ways. The first one is expansionary policies to increase the demand. Expansionary policies is basically when you cut down the tax and you increase government spending. Okay, so let's summarize this because this is very long. It basically means when there is an increase in demand. Okay, I'm going to speed through this because it's more of direct. Increase in government spending will increase the demand. Okay, when there's an increase in demand, the production level is to be increased because people are getting profits. The firms are getting profits. If they have getting profits, meaning they can invest into their business on the the capital side, so meaning they will employ more workers so they can have a higher output. If they have a higher output, they have higher, for example, they have higher profit. If they have higher profit, then they can keep making more workers, and therefore there will be more employed people, which will be helpful. Similarly, if you cut interest rates, okay, then the banks will be unwilling to lend to businesses, okay, due to low confidence in the economy. Okay, and hence cutting tax rates won't help people if people don't have confidence in an economy and would prefer to save. Okay, the next one is the depreciate the exchange rate. Okay, this basically means that as the currency depreciates, the country's exports will become cheaper, and so the export demand from abroad will increase, which will help boost the production and the employment in the export industries. The next one, you control inflation. Inflation is simply when the prices go too high. Okay, and hence when the high inflation will cause workers to lay off because they want to reduce costs, and hence the government will try to control inflation. Okay, they will simply try to control inflation. The next one is cutting unemployment benefits, because remember previously we talked about that people remain unemployed so that they can get the benefits. But if the benefits are not that high, people have to work because they need to live, so they have to work, hence the employment rate will increase. The next one is restricting imports and encouraging exports. That is the reason why imports are so expensive. If imports are so expensive, they have to encourage exports. And if they encourage exports, meaning there will be more local employment, okay? There will be more people required so that they can satisfy the consumers' needs, okay? So that's why that can help in employment. And then we have cutting down the minimum wage. When the minimum wage increases, the firm's labor costs will also increase, and so they will lay off the workers. Okay, but if you lower these minimum wages, then firms will start hiring more people. Okay, we have then the removed labor market regulations. Okay, the labor market regulation simply means that if you let these markets to have a free hand in the labor market, meaning for example, they can decide the minimum wage, the maximum wage, or they can decide when to hire or fire workers, there's more flexibility. Hence the firms will be happy, hence they will employ more people. But again, this can be a greater job insecurity, as it says right here, because you don't know when you can be fired, so the fear will always be there. Okay, so there can be a drawback to that also. We then have training and retraining. The government can help in education, because if they gain the education, they can be employed. Okay, so the benefits of providing skills and training will be for the long term. And remember, this one will take time. Okay, the education always takes time, because of course someone has to go through all that learning and then they can be working. So this one takes time. The next one is promote industries in the unemployed areas. Okay, so this basically means that a lot of employment is created when the government provides subsidies and tax breaks for new industries who set up in certain backward regions. Okay, so basically this means is that if you promote, then people will be employed. We have the increase in geographically mobility of labor. Okay, this means that frictional unemployment is caused because people can't move around to find jobs. The government can improve the labor mobility by investing in transport and housing services. Okay, so the government has to do all this so that they can increase employment. Maybe if it is easy to find a job, people will actually be willing to work. Okay, and last but not least, last thing about this topic is providing information. Some people don't even know that it's this easy to get employed. Some people are scared just to do the interview, or some people are scared that they don't have the skills. But if you provide the information that, this particular job does not need any skills, people will work, and therefore the employment will increase. So you need to tell your society about the various information for this to work. We now move on. Okay, inflation and deflation. Another big topic. Here we'll talk about the causes of inflation. We'll talk about the consequences of inflation. We'll have a look at how we can control this inflation. Then we'll have a look at deflation, which is basically the opposite of inflation. So therefore the causes will be the opposite. The consequences will be opposite, and also the policies to control this deflation will be opposite. So let's have a look at inflation and deflation. So we start off by saying, what is inflation? What is deflation? Inflation is simply the general and sustained rise in the level of prices. So the key word right here is the rise in the level of prices. There's a rise in the level of prices. The level of prices of goods and services rise. Okay, and that's the reason why there's inflation. Now, inflation is measured using something called the Consumer Price Index, which basically means CPI, or Retail Price Index, or RPI, and the Consumer Price Index is calculated in this way. So let's start off. Number one is that the selection of goods and services are normally purchased by a typical family or a household, which is identified. That's the first thing you have to identify. The government does all of this, first of all. The next one is that the prices of these basket of goods and services will be monitored at a number of different retail outlets. So we're looking at the shops. Okay, we're looking at the shops of the different, in your economy. We're having a look at all these goods and services, and you have to monitor the different numbers. Okay, the next one, the average price of that basket in the first year or the base year is given a value of 100. The average changes in the price of goods over the year, so that the different years is then calculated. So for example, we have an example right here. If it rises by an average of 25%, okay, it will be 125% times 100 equals to 125. If in the next year there is a further average increase by 10%, it will become 110 times the previous year, which was 125. So 110 times 125. So like that, it will keep calculating, and then to get the rate of how many years, you just minus from the current minus the start of which was 100 to get your inflation rate. So it's as simple as that. Nothing much complicated. It's quite simple. But now, what causes this inflation? Why does inflation happen? First of all, inflation is actually a really small topic, and we've talked about so much about inflation because we talk about inflation in economic growth, we talk about inflation in employment, unemployment, we talk about inflation literally in all the topics, because inflation is the reason why because inflation and demand are related. So hence we have something called the demand pull inflation. The demand pull inflation is simply when inflation is caused because there's a rise in demand. When there's a rise in demand, the producers will know that they're capable of buying this certain product, and hence they will increase their price of the product. Okay, and hence there will be demand pull inflation. The next one is cost push inflation. When there is an increase in the cost of production, meaning they are finding their production so expensive, they will rise the price of that product, which will lead to cost push inflation. And then finally, they will say the next one is, okay, so those are the two. And then there's also a lot of economic agrees that a rise in the money supply, okay, is a key reason for inflation. Okay, so because if there's more money supply, right, people will be having more money to spend. Hence, that's the reason why inflation is. Because sometimes you realize that at one point, bread costed 1 million. Okay, if you do history, you would know this. I don't really remember, but I think it was something related to Germany's Great Depression or something related to that, where in that point, bread was costing about $1 million or something related to that. I really don't know, but it's just an example, right? Because they started printing the money. They started printing so much money that there was inflation, because it was so hard just to get bread because it was so expensive. And why does this happen? Okay, why does this happen? The first one is lower purchasing power. When the price rise, when the price level rises, that the poor people can't even afford, inflation occurs. The next one is that the exports are less internationally competitive. That means if the exports are high, its competitiveness, its international markets will also fall. Okay, so we're talking about exports here. Then we say inflation causes inflation, because if inflation, people won't be able to afford it, and even the firms won't be able to gain profit, so they will keep increasing their money, right? Because they want to because they have to pay the workers a lot of money, because so that they can survive themselves. So meaning they have to increase the prices. So inflation will cause inflation, which will cause inflation. So it'll keep increasing, okay, which will cause cost push inflation, because the production levels will be so much, because they have to the firms, right, that are deciding to increase the price. Remember, their workers are the ones who are in the economy, okay? And for them to survive, they have to also increase the wages. Someone can say, there is inflation, give me wages. And the supplier has to agree with that. And hence, he will increase the price of the product so the profit is higher, and so he can, afford the workers. Okay? So that will cause cost push inflation. And then we have the fixed income groups: lenders, savers, and loss. And so this, what basically means is that a person who has a fixed income will lose because some people sign a contract that their wages cannot increase no matter what happens. For those type of people, they will suffer. Okay, and also the savers will lose, because if people save on their banks and then there's inflation, the value of that money that they have saved is literally, there's no point of saving it. Instead, you would have spent it before. Okay, hence, that is also one reason why inflation happens. Now, how can we control this inflation? Because the government has to control inflation, okay, because they don't want all these bad things to happen to the economy. The first thing is the contractionary monetary policy, which basically means this will help reduce demand. Okay, when the demand is too much, they need to help reduce this demand. Okay, and this is the most popular policy which is usually used. And what they do is they will raise the interest rates. And if they raise the interest rate, people will not spend a lot. Instead, they will save more money. Hence, they will not buy so many goods and services. Hence, the demand will fall. In simple terms, that's all this long thing means. The next thing is contractionary fiscal policy. Contractionary fiscal policy is a policy that will reduce demand because of raising taxes, which will discourage the spending. If the taxes on a particular good is so high, they will not want to spend on it, hence the demand will fall. The next one is supply side policy. The supply side policy, remember, was we talked about this in part 1. Basically, supply side policy, for example, privatization and deregulation, helps the firm more competitive and efficient. Hence, they don't want to make inflation, because as long as the firms are happy, they're getting money, they can afford the workers, why inflation? Okay, and the government will use supply side policies so that everyone is happy at the end of the day. Okay, the next one the next one is the exchange rate policy. Exchange rate policy basically means that the appreciating the domestic currency can lower the import prices, which will help cause the reduce the cost push inflation. And basically, it also makes the export more expensive, which will help lower the export demanded in the economy, as well as create incentives for exporting firms to remain competitive. Okay, so this whole thing basically just means the exchange rate policy talks about basically when there's domestic currency which is lower than the import prices, that means export prices will, the demand will have lower effect, because people will just start importing. Okay, hence import and export should be equal. But remember, there's something, you have to also balance your import and export. We talked about this in part 1. You can have a look at that too. So deflation, let's have a look at deflation. Deflation is the opposite of inflation. Deflation is the general fall in the price of goods. And again, deflation is measured using the CPI. It's the same thing as I just talked about before. It is given 100, and then it basically looks at the deflation, the drop in the average prices, and then you multiply that by the certain price, and per year you just do the same thing, so on, so on, so on, and so on. What is the causes of deflation? Is the opposite of inflation. Demand falls, inflation happens. Why does demand fall? Maybe, for example, people don't have enough, or maybe when the supply is too much, it exceeds the demand. Okay, when there's too much output, there will be a fall in demand, or there will be a fall in price. When there's too much of a certain product and the demand is not that much, of course there will be a fall in price, so that they can get more sales. The next one is the demand has fallen. If the demand has fallen during a recession, a fall in demand in the economy will cause the general prices to fall, because not everyone can afford those high prices. Hence, there will be a fall in demand, causing deflation. Because remember, inflation happens when there's a rise in demand. So therefore, deflation should mean that when there is a fall in demand, it should occur. The next thing is the labor productivity has risen, which means that when there's higher output, it will lead to lower average cost, which could reflect as lower prices for products. Then we have the technological advance, okay, which means this has reduced the cost of production, pulling down the cost, push inflation. So the consequences of deflation. First one, lower prices, which will discourage the production, resulting to unemployment. The prices will be so low that the employment will be discouraged. The next one, as demand and prices fall, the investors will be discouraged to invest because they don't have enough profit. Deflation can cause recession, because if there's deflation, okay, there'll be fall in demand, okay, and therefore the firms will be closing down. If they close down, the output will reduce, causing recession. Tax revenue will fall. Tax revenue will fall because demand falls, the output falls. If output falls, they will not have enough tax revenue on that particular good. As simple as that. And then we have borrowers will lose during the deflation, the deflation, because now the value of the debt they owe is higher than when they borrowed the money. So hence the borrowers will lose during a deflation. The next one is that deflation will increase the real debt burden on the government, because the value of the government, because remember, first tax revenue reduces, okay, and the government relies on tax revenue. So if tax revenue falls, the government will be in trouble. Okay, then we have the policies to control this. Again, it's similar to the inflation, but here we're saying that expansionary monetary policies basically mean that cutting interest rates will encourage more spending, which will increase the rise in prices and cause deflation. Okay, and this is called the liquidity trap. The liquidity trap is called that. The next one is the expansionary fiscal policy, so that you can revive the demand, because there's a fall in demand currently. The government will start spending more, and we know when the government spends more, there will be an increase in demand. That's all you need to know. When there's more government spending, there's more demand, because of the so on examples that I've given throughout the video. For example, I'll keep reminding you, if the government spends on education, there will be more work, meaning they'll have more employment. If they have more employment, they'll have more income. If they have more income, they'll have more demand, because they will have the money to buy those goods and services that they desire. The next one is devaluation. Devaluation basically means when there's a deflation, right, the currency will of course fall, okay, and hence also will cause the export prices to fall, which will encourage the production of export products. So using devaluation, it will basically increase the money supply, okay, and if it increases the money supply, then it will cause the export prices to fall, hence encouraging people to buy export products, okay, and hence will be more demand. The final one is change inflation expectations. When a deflation is expected, the businesses won't increase wages and consumer won't pay higher wages. But this of course causes deflation. But if the monetary authorities indicate that they have a higher inflation, then the firms will pay their workers more and consumer will spend more, avoiding deflation, because everyone wants to avoid deflation. But if you tell everyone that there will be inflation, right, If you tell everyone there'll be inflation, they'll start spending more, right? That's how everything works, and that's the human mentality. So that ends the mark of today's. That ends the this ends the video. Basically, we talked about the three topics. Hopefully you understood all the three topics. We talked about economic growth, employment, and unemployment, and we finally had a look at inflation and deflation. If you haven't looked at part 1, go ahead and look at part 1 for chapter 4. If you want to have a look at chapter 1, 2, and 3, also go have a look at that. All will be down in the description, and also I have done some past paper videos that I will be putting down in the description. So all of these videos will be down in the description. Hopefully you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in the next economics video. Goodbye.